The moment he pressed me against the cold cement wall of the garage, with one hand wrapped firmly around both my wrists and the other braced against the metal shelving behind me, I didn't think about Michael or the marriage or the years or the Sunday dinners or the family barbecues where Ethan stood 3 feet from me drinking beer like any good friend of the family would. I only felt the heat of his breath sliding against the side of my neck, steady and close and too familiar. And then his voice, low and sharp like it was cutting through something thick between us, said, "So, she's really going to do it?" And before I could pull breath into my lungs to even think of a reply, his mouth crashed into mine with the kind of force that doesn't ask permission, it takes it. And in that stolen second, I realized he had never been asking me anything. Not now, not then, because he already knew the answer. I told myself that this hadn't come out of nowhere, that the signs were there if I had just looked harder, and maybe I had been looking all along without admitting it. Because 2 days before that kiss, I had stood barefoot in the hallway with a damp towel in my hands and heard his voice rise from the open window above the garage, clear as a confession and 10 times more dangerous. He said, "She's bored, man. I see how she looks at me." And I froze. Not because it was a lie, but because it wasn't. Because deep down I knew exactly what he was talking about, and I hated how my body reacted like a live wire had been touched. And then the second phrase came louder this time, cocky and raw like a dare shot through a smirk. "Give her one touch and she'll melt, trust me." And I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink, just stood there with my heart slamming so hard against my ribs I thought it would leave bruises, because hearing him say it out loud stripped away the thin layer of decency I'd been hiding behind, and in that moment I didn't feel offended or insulted. I felt seen and exposed and terrifyingly alive. That whole evening I couldn't stop watching him while he bent under the hood of Michael's car, his sleeves rolled high, grease smudging his arms, and every few minutes he'd glance toward the kitchen like he knew I was standing there with my hands on the windowsill, pretending I wasn't staring, pretending I wasn't aware of the way his shirt clung to his back or how his fingers moved, like he wasn't just fixing the engine but pulling something loose inside of me. That night, I lay awake listening to Michael snore beside me, the fan, turning lazily above the bed, and my fingers rested on my stomach like I was trying to hold something down, something that buzzed just beneath the skin, like an itch you can't scratch without drawing blood. And I told myself it was nothing, that it would pass, but it didn't. It stayed there like a spark looking for dry grass. The next day, Ethan came back, same truck, same boots, same look in his eyes, and not rushed, not hesitant, just inevitable, and he said, "You heard us, didn't you?" I didn't answer, didn't look up, didn't move, but I felt him standing behind me like gravity had shifted, like the air had thickened just around us, and when his fingers brushed mine, barely a touch, barely even contact, I didn't flinch. I didn't yank away, I just let it happen, let the electricity pass from him to me like a secret being transferred without words, and then he walked away, leaving behind only the scent of metal and sweat and something I didn't want to name. That evening, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, towel still wrapped around my damp hair, toothbrush untouched in the sink, and stared at my reflection like it was a stranger who had stepped into my life wearing my skin, and I said it out loud, not loud enough for Michael to hear, but loud enough for the woman in the mirror to understand the terms of what was coming. "You want to see if I'll melt? Try me." And in that moment, I wasn't scared. I wasn't ashamed. I wasn't anything except ready. I woke up before sunrise, not because of an alarm or Michael shifting in his sleep, but because my body was already humming with something restless and unresolved. The kind of buzz that settles in your spine when you've said yes to something without speaking, when you've crossed a line without taking a single step. And I spent the early hours of that morning walking barefoot from room to room, like I was trying to remember who I used to be before everything changed, like retracing old memories might cancel out the ones that were now planting themselves deep inside my chest. Michael left before breakfast, said something about picking up tools, maybe tires, maybe nothing, and I smiled and nodded and handed him his coffee like nothing had shifted beneath the floorboards, like there wasn't a tension. Behind my ribs that had a name and a face and a rough voice that I could still feel in my ear, and after the door shut behind him, the house settled into that kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but waiting. I put on a t-shirt that clung a little too close and a pair of shorts I hadn't worn in years, and I walked barefoot through the grass to the side of the house, where the sun hadn't yet reached and the air still held onto the coolness of night, and I crouched by the roses, pretending to prune, pretending not to hear the gravel crunch under slow footsteps behind me, and then that voice again, not loud, but direct, the kind that doesn't test the waters but dives in. "You heard us, didn't you?" I didn't answer, not with words, because my silence was the answer and he knew it, and I felt the heat of him standing behind me, the space between us charged like something electric, and when his hand brushed over mine, slow and deliberate, It wasn't a question and it wasn't an apology. It was a line being drawn with skin, and I didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't shiver, just let it happen, and then let it go as he turned and walked away without waiting to see what came next. All day I thought about that moment, about the weight of his hand, about the way it didn't feel invasive or rushed but intentional, like every move he made was part of something he'd already decided, and I tried to distract myself with laundry and half-watched TV and phone calls I didn't answer, but none of it stuck, because all I could see was his hand on mine, his eyes glancing up through the windshield when I brought Michael lemonade last week, his voice carrying through the vent, like a challenge wrapped in heat. I waited until the house was quiet again, until Michael's breathing settled into the familiar rhythm of sleep, and I stood in front of the mirror brushing my teeth like it was just another night. But when I looked up and met my own eyes, there was something unfamiliar there. Not guilt, not fear, but a kind of curiosity I hadn't felt in years, a question I hadn't let myself ask in forever. And my lips moved on their own, not as a whisper, but as a dare. "You want to see if I'll melt? Try me." And the words hung in the air like perfume, soft and heavy and impossible to ignore. I lay in bed after that, still as a statue, staring at the ceiling while Michael's arm rested over my stomach like an anchor, and I wondered if he could feel the shift, if he knew that something between us had bent slightly out of shape, not broken, not yet, but moved just enough to let the light in where it didn't belong. And I told myself again that nothing had really happened. Not yet, not technically, but it didn't matter because my body already knew the difference between pretending and becoming. And I think that's when I realized I wasn't afraid of the fire, not really. I was afraid of what it would reveal, of what I might see in the ashes once it burned through the careful structure I'd built, once it turned the familiar into something I couldn't explain away. And I knew that tomorrow wouldn't be about right or wrong or loyalty or betrayal. It would be about the moment I'd stopped being a spectator in my own life and started playing with matches. So I closed my eyes and told myself to rest, just a few hours, just enough to make it through another morning. But my heart wouldn't. Slow, and my fingers curled into the sheets like they were holding on to a secret. And somewhere deep in the marrow of me, I knew that the question wasn't if I'd melt, but how fast it would happen once he touched flame to skin. The heat came early that morning, pressing through the windows before I even made coffee, clinging to my skin and making everything feel louder, sharper, heavier than it should have been. And I kept drifting from room to room like a woman trying to escape her own thoughts, pretending to tidy, pretending to scroll through news I didn't read, pretending not to check the clock every 10 minutes. And then I heard it, the back door creaking open without a knock. And I didn't need to ask who it was because I already knew he'd come, and I knew he'd come alone, because the brakes could have waited, but whatever this was couldn't. And when he stepped inside and said, "Got something for your husband?" it wasn't a greeting or an excuse, it was a warning wrapped in a smirk. I was leaning against the counter in a thin tank top and a pair of old cotton shorts I hadn't worn outside the bedroom in years. Not because they were too revealing, but because I'd forgotten what it felt like to wear something that made me aware of my body. And when he saw me like that, he paused in the doorway, his gaze dragging over me slow and unapologetic before landing back on my eyes with something darker behind it, and he smiled, easy and low, like we were already in the middle of a game. Only he knew how to play, and said, "You always this comfortable with house guests?" And I could have laughed, could have covered up, could have shifted the tone back to neutral. But I didn't. He walked past me into the kitchen, grabbed an apple from the bowl without asking, sat down at the table and leaned back like he belonged. There, his leg stretching under the table just enough to graze my shin, and I didn't move away, didn't twitch or flinch or pretend not to notice. I just stayed right where I was and felt the quiet heat of that single point of contact spreading, like ink in water. And he took a bite and started talking about nothing. About how he used to bike through this neighborhood when he was 16, about how he'd seen me walking Emily to school and thought our house looked like a catalog photo, about how sometimes the most perfect things have cracks you can't see unless you know where to look. And then he glanced up at me with a smirk, like he was waiting for me to crack too, and said, "But perfect cracks, right?" He asked me to help him in the garage, said he needed a hand with a stuck reservoir cap, said it real casual, like he didn't already know I'd say yes, like we hadn't both already stepped over the same invisible line twice now, and were just pretending it still mattered where it was drawn. So I followed him through the side door, out into the thick air where the heat rose in visible waves off the pavement, and inside the garage it was worse. The kind of heat that settles in your bones and makes you forget what fresh air ever felt. And I handed him a rag when he asked, and the moment I did, he turned and pinned me lightly against the front of the car. Not roughly, not suddenly, but with the kind of pressure that says, this isn't an accident and we both know it. He looked down at me, not grinning now, but serious, quiet, focused, like a man listening to the sound of something he's about to break, and he leaned in close enough for his voice to brush my skin and said, "You're not leaving this garage dry. and the words hit me with the force of a slammed door and a whispered secret all at once. And without thinking, without breathing, I answered, "That depends on how you touch the engine." And the second I heard myself say it, I felt something snap inside me, not in pain, but in recognition, like I'd just admitted a truth I'd been holding in my mouth for too long. He laughed, not loud, not cruel, but low and thick with something dangerous, and that laugh curled around me and held me in place, and then his hand slid up along the side of my thigh, slow and deliberate, and my breath caught somewhere behind my ribs as my eyes drifted closed and I felt the first real shiver of fear and want melt together, and I didn't stop him. Not at first, not until the very moment his fingers reached the edge of the fabric and I suddenly stepped back and said, "That's enough," with a voice that trembled just enough to betray me. He didn't argue, didn't push, didn't reach again. He just looked at me and smiled with that same unshakable calm he always wore when something was about to go his way and said, "Not even close," before walking past me and disappearing into the sunlight like it had all been a test and I had only passed the first part. I stayed there in the garage long after he left, one hand still resting on the edge of the hood like I needed something solid to keep me upright, the heat pressing in from every side until it felt like my skin would split from holding in everything. I didn't say, everything I didn't do, but almost did, and I stared at the smudges his hands had left on the paint, dark fingerprints near the latch, oily echoes of the moment he pinned me there, and I knew those marks would fade, but the impression he left on me wouldn't scrub out so easy. When I finally moved, it wasn't because I wanted to. It was because the silence got so thick it started to feel like noise, and I walked back into the house with the kind of hollow steps that feel loud even on carpet, peeled off my clothes, and stood under the shower. With the water turned up so hot it made my shoulders sting, but even after rinsing twice and scrubbing my legs with the cheap lavender soap I always bought on sale, I could still feel where his hand had been, not physically, but in that way that stays just beneath the skin, vibrating. I dried off, dressed, and spent the next few hours trying to pretend I was fine, wiping down the kitchen counters that were already clean, folding towels that didn't need folding, opening the fridge 3 different times just to look inside and close it again, all while my eyes kept drifting back to the garage window, like maybe I'd see him come back, like maybe he'd knock this time, but he didn't, and I knew he wouldn't, because what he left behind was already more than enough. It wasn't until the middle of the night, long after Michael had fallen, into the kind of deep, open-mouthed sleep that made his breathing sound like a warning bell in my ear, that I slipped out of bed barefoot and quiet, wrapping a robe around myself like armor I didn't believe in, and walked through the dark house, out to the garage again, not because I needed anything from it, but because something inside me wouldn't let me sleep until I saw it one more time, until I stood in the place where it almost happened. I opened the side door slowly, let it creak all the way so I wouldn't pretend I was sneaking, and stepped. Inside, the air thick with that same hot metal scent that now made my throat tighten, and I walked straight to the car and lifted the hood like I had any right to, like I was the one doing the work, and there it was, a piece of paper, folded twice, tucked neatly beside the battery where only I would think to look, and even before I opened it, I knew it was from him. The handwriting was sharp, not messy, but quick, written like he didn't need to think too hard about the words, and it said only 2 things. "Tomorrow. You decide." And for a second I stood there with the paper in my hand like it weighed more than it should have, like it was soaked with something thicker than ink, and I thought about tearing it, thought about walking back inside and flushing it or tossing it in the trash where it belonged. But I didn't. I folded it again and slipped it into the pocket of my robe and closed the hood gently, like I didn't want to wake the car. I went back to bed but didn't sleep. Didn't even lie down right away. Just sat on the edge with the paper in my pocket and my hands on my knees and the clock blinking in the corner of the room like it knew something I didn't. And when I finally crawled under the sheets, Michael shifted in his sleep and reached for me, his hand finding my waist like muscle memory, like habit, like a man who thinks the woman next to him is still the one he kissed at 19. And I let him hold me, but didn't move closer, didn't rest my head on his chest the way I used to, because all I could think about was the heat in the garage, the weight of that moment, and the way it had rewired something in me that I wasn't sure I wanted fixed. And in that still, stale air, as I lay next to a man I once couldn't sleep without, I realized that the decision Ethan had written down wasn't really about him or even about tomorrow. It was about whether I was willing to keep pretending that the life I had was enough, whether I could keep playing the part with the same conviction when I already knew the script had changed. The moment I stepped into the garage the next evening, the door slammed behind me with a force that wasn't accidental, and before I could fully process the sound or the rush of heat that clung to the air like something too thick to breathe. Ethan had already crossed the space between us in 2 long strides, his hand pushing the door shut behind my back and his mouth crashing into mine with a kind of urgency that didn't ask questions, didn't hesitate, didn't try to hide behind pretense or politeness. And as his lips pressed hard against mine, I felt my fingers curl into the fabric of his shirt, grabbing at the collar and dragging him closer. Not out of panic or protest, but out of something far more dangerous. Permission. There was no time to think, no space for second guesses, just the thrum of blood rushing through my ears and the way his hands gripped my hips like he'd been counting down the minutes for this exact moment. And when he finally pulled back, just enough for his breath to brush against my lips, he whispered against my mouth with a voice that was thick and raw and close enough to make my knees weaken. I just needed you to say yes. And I didn't hesitate, didn't blink, just met his gaze and said what we both already knew. I didn't say no. The garage was stifling, the air vibrating around us with the rhythm of our breathing, harsh and uneven and desperate. And when he lifted me onto the work table, the cool metal pressing against the backs of my thighs sent a sharp chill through, the heat pooling inside me, and he tugged off his gloves, dropping them to the floor without looking. Both hands now free as they slid up the insides of my legs, tracing the skin like it was something fragile and forbidden. And when he hesitated just a beat, I leaned forward and kissed him first. Not the rushed, reckless kiss from before, but something deeper, slower, more deliberate. A kiss that claimed instead of asked, and he responded in kind, pressing harder, holding longer, like he knew this moment wasn't going to happen twice. He pulled back enough to look at me, eyes dark, voice lower than I'd ever heard it, and asked, "Are you scared?" And the answer came before I could stop it, raw and honest and stripped of any pretense. Yes, but not enough to stop. And just as those words left my mouth, my phone buzzed on the edge of the bench, screen lighting up with Michael's name, and I froze, heart punching against my ribs like it was trying to warn me, trying to claw its way out of the mess I was creating. But I forced myself to grab it with hands that weren't steady, pressing it to my ear and speaking with a voice I didn't recognize, low and level and too calm to be real. "Everything's fine here," I said, staring straight ahead, not blinking, not breathing, while Ethan leaned in and kissed the curve of my neck, slow and unbothered, his mouth pressing softly against the place where my pulse raced like an alarm. I ended the call without waiting for a reply, the silence in the room swallowing the last word, and I turned my head just enough to whisper, not to him, not even to myself, but to the air, "That was wrong," and without missing a beat, his lips still at my throat, he murmured back, "Then why do you look like you won?" And I didn't answer, couldn't answer, because the question hit harder than his kiss. I didn't say anything. Not because I didn't have words, but because the ones that came to mind would have made the moment crumble, would have dragged it out of whatever heat-fueled haze we were tangled in and dropped it under the weight of reality. So instead, I closed my eyes and leaned into the feeling of his mouth against my neck, the slow, deliberate pressure of his hands holding my thighs in place, his fingers kneading like he was trying to memorize me through touch alone. And for one long breath, I let it all happen, not worrying about what came next, not calculating consequences, just listening to the thud of my heart and the way it answered every one of his movements like a rhythm it had been waiting to hear again. His hands didn't shake, not like mine. They were steady, patient, like he had all the time in the world to make a point without saying another word. And when he looked up at me, eyes sharp but not cruel, I saw the boy he used to be behind the man he'd become, the one who must have watched from across our lawn for years and wondered if the woman who waved from the porch was ever really present in the life she built, or just performing a version of it for everyone else. I reached for him again, not because I didn't know better, but because I did, and somewhere in that knowing there was a hunger I didn't recognize as mine, and when our lips met this time, it wasn't frantic, it wasn't bruising or rushed, it was something else entirely. It was long, deep, slow enough to feel every second pass like warm syrup in my veins, and I kissed him like I was giving up an answer I'd been holding on to too long, one he had asked without words, one I couldn't keep denying. My legs tightened around his waist and his arms circled me like he was trying to pull me inside out, and for that moment the garage didn't exist. The house didn't exist. My husband didn't exist. There was just the smell of motor oil and his skin, the warmth of his breath, and the way his name lived unspoken at the back of my throat. And I could have let it go further. I know I could have, because every nerve in my body was already screaming, yes, even if my mouth hadn't spoken it yet. But then something shifted, not in him, not in the air, but in me. A flicker of myself flashing in like a warning, the sound of Michael's voice from the call still echoing somewhere deeper than I wanted to admit, and I pulled away just a few inches, not enough to break the spell, but just enough to see his face clearly. And when I did, I saw the question in his eyes again, the one he didn't say out loud this time, the one that asked if I was going to let this be real or walk away like it hadn't just happened. I didn't answer. I just slid off the bench slowly, my hands still trembling from the charge he left in them, my lips sore in a way that felt like a confession, and he didn't stop me, didn't say anything, just stepped back with that same half-smile he always wore when he thought he'd won without playing the final hand. And I turned toward the door, every part of me aching with something I couldn't name, something that felt too close to grief and too far from guilt. I didn't look back when I opened the garage door, didn't wait for him to follow. Just stepped into the night air that wrapped around me like cold proof of what had just happened. And I walked through the backyard with bare feet and flushed skin, and the sound of my own breathing louder than it had any right to be. And when I stepped inside the house, I didn't head for the stairs, didn't go to the bathroom or the kitchen or anywhere that made sense. I just stood in the dark hallway, my hand still on the doorknob, staring at nothing. And then I turned back around just for a moment and walked quietly down the steps to the garage again, not because I wanted more, but because I needed to see it, the space, the scene, the evidence of who I'd become in a matter of minutes. And when I opened the door again, the room was empty, but the air still held his heat, and on the floor, where I'd barely noticed him drop them, were his gloves, lying in the exact spot where he'd taken them off like the start of a ritual neither of us knew how to finish. I stood there alone, lips swollen, chest tight, hands unsteady, staring down at those gloves like they held an answer I couldn't bring myself to pick up. And for the first time, I realized I hadn't crossed the line. I'd erased it. For the next 3 days, I didn't go outside except to collect the mail or water the front bushes just enough to avoid suspicion from the neighbors. I didn't text him, didn't call, didn't even walk toward the garage unless I had a reason I could justify out loud, and yet I found myself at the window a dozen times a day, standing there like a woman waiting for a storm she swore she didn't want, peeking through the side curtain at the patch of driveway where his truck used to be, checking the sky for signs of headlights even though I told myself I was done, even though I had no intention of opening that door again, but every hour that passed without seeing him made something itch in my blood, and I hated how much I missed the sound of his boots on concrete and the weight of his gaze on the back of my neck like it belonged there. I kept telling myself I was in control, that I was stronger than this thing pulling me off course, but when his name lit up on my phone with a photo attached, I opened it faster than I meant to, my heart kicking like I'd just been caught doing something I wasn't supposed to, and the image was nothing at all, just a bottle of brake fluid dripping down a rusted pipe. But the caption beneath it was worse than anything explicit. It read, "Your system's leaking." And I stared at it so long I forgot to blink, forgot where I was, forgot I wasn't supposed to care anymore. And before I could stop myself, I typed "Don't tempt me" and hit send without even reading it back. Michael came home that evening in better spirits than usual, carrying a 6-pack and 2 bags of groceries like he was trying to surprise me, said he missed dinners together, said he could take the weekend off if I wanted, and I nodded and smiled and helped him unpack while something inside me unraveled at the edges, because even though I was right there in the kitchen with him, I felt like I was watching myself from the outside, like I was wearing a version of myself he still believed in, and when he leaned in to kiss me, I let him, but my mouth didn't move, my lips didn't respond, and he pulled back with a quiet frown I pretended not to notice. Later that night, we sat on the couch and put on one of those old thrillers he used to love, the kind where the plot moves slow but the tension crackles underneath, and he kept reaching for my hand and glancing at me like he wanted me to laugh at the same lines we used to. And I tried. I really did. But all I could see behind my eyes was the garage, the steel table, the heat of Ethan's body between my legs, the smell of motor oil and sweat, the way his voice slid into my ear like it belonged there, and even with Michael's arm around me and the soft flicker of the TV reflecting in the windows, I couldn't shake the image of what had already happened, and what still might. It was well past midnight when my phone buzzed again, and I didn't want to look, but of course I did. And this time it was a photo of Ethan lying across the hood of a car with his arms behind his head like he didn't have a care in the world, his shirt riding up just enough to show the edge of his stomach, and that same cocky grin that made me furious and flustered at once. And the caption was short, "If you want me, you'll find me." And I turned the screen off so fast I nearly dropped the phone, tossed it face down on the couch, and stared straight ahead like it was going to erase the heat rising in my chest. But I didn't delete it. I told myself it meant nothing, that I was just curious, that it was natural to look back once or twice at something that had shaken me. And the next morning when I said I was going to the store, Michael didn't question it, just kissed me on the cheek and said to grab those granola bars he liked, and I nodded and left the house with my heart already racing, even though I didn't know yet what I was going to do. I just drove in circles for nearly an hour before finally heading back, pulling into the driveway later than usual. And when Michael stepped outside with a confused smile and asked, "Where have you been?" I said nowhere, and kissed his cheek before slipping past him into the house. The next morning started like any other, except for the way I couldn't breathe right, the way every sound in the house felt sharper, more intrusive, like the clinking of dishes was trying to tell on me, like the wind brushing the screen door was asking if I was proud of the woman I was becoming. And when Michael came into the kitchen and kissed me softly on the forehead, with sleep still in his eyes, and said he'd be home late because of a meeting across town, I smiled and kissed him back, let my lips linger just long enough to mimic normal, and he didn't ask anything, didn't press, just grabbed his thermos and walked out like this was any other Wednesday in any other marriage where no one had anything to hide. I watched his truck pull away from the window over the sink, stood there barefoot in my old robe with wet hair dripping down my spine, and before the sound of the engine had even faded down the street, I was already moving, not in a rush, not with panic, but with a kind of quiet inevitability, the kind of movement you make when you've already had the argument with yourself and lost. And it wasn't 15 minutes before I found myself standing in the doorway of the garage, hand on the metal handle, breath held like I was about to dive underwater. I stepped inside slowly, the way you step into a place that remembers things, and the heat wrapped around me the way it always did, thick and restless and familiar, and I walked to the car without touching anything, like I was trying not to wake up whatever had settled, into the corners of the room. And when I reached the hood, I stood there for a moment, not sure what I was expecting. Maybe the silence, maybe a note, maybe the leftover trace of his voice in the air. But what I found was worse. He was there, lying on the hood like the night before, but this time he wasn't posing for a photo. This time he was flesh and breath and smirk, arms crossed behind. His head, sunglasses low on his nose, and that same kind of calm in his posture that made it impossible to tell whether he was waiting for me or just knew I'd come, and I should have turned around right then. I should have walked out before. He said a word, but I didn't. I just stared at him like the answer to everything I couldn't admit was carved across his chest. He didn't speak at first, just watched me with a slow, deliberate smile like he was cataloging every part of my hesitation. And then he sat up and slid off the hood with the kind of smooth motion that made it impossible not to watch. And he walked right up to me and stopped so close I could see the heat rising off his skin. And he reached for my hand and didn't squeeze it, didn't pull, just wrapped his fingers around mine like he was asking a question without speaking. And when I didn't step away, when I didn't flinch or break the contact, he leaned in and murmured near my cheek, "Still pretending you don't want me?" I didn't answer. Because the truth was, I didn't know what I wanted anymore. Or maybe I did, and I just didn't want to say it out loud, because saying it would make it real, and real meant wreckage. And right then, all I could feel was the warmth of his skin, the scent of grease and sweat and whatever it was that always made the space between us throb like a second pulse. And I just stood there staring at the place where his hand held mine, silently screaming at myself to let go, to step back, to remember the man who left the house with coffee in his hand and trust still in his voice. But my feet didn't move, and neither did my mouth. The room felt smaller than it had an hour ago, the walls closer, the floor softer, like the garage itself was leaning in to listen, and I hated how quiet the world had become, how every sound had been stripped away except the thudding of my own heart and the faint echo of his question still ringing in my ear. And I knew whatever I said next would shape what came after, that this was the kind of moment you can't rewind or bury, the kind that lives in your bloodstream for years like a splinter you never dig out. But instead of speaking, I just closed my eyes, not to avoid him, but to avoid myself, to shut out the 1,000 little voices clawing for control. And when he stepped even closer and pressed his forehead to mine, I didn't stop him. I didn't say anything at all. I didn't hear the car at first, didn't hear the gate or the gravel under the tires or the way the door clicked shut with that familiar dull thud that always meant Michael was home earlier than planned, because the only thing I heard in that moment was my own voice trembling. As it rose from my throat without permission, breathless and broken and lost in the haze of heat and motion and pressure between my legs, whispering, "Don't stop," into the sweat-thickened air of the garage, while Ethan's hands held my hips, and his mouth worked against my skin with a rhythm that had stripped me of shame and timing and every instinct I thought would keep me safe from this. And when the door opened behind us, I didn't hear it right away. I only felt the sudden drop in air, the rush of silence that came too fast and too complete to mean anything good. For a second, no one moved, no one breathed, no one existed except in the ring of silence that pulsed between the three of us like a fire alarm set to mute. And I opened my mouth and whispered, "Mike." Like that would somehow pull him back from the cliff. Like the sound of his name on my lips could undo the scene in front of him. But it was too late because he'd already seen everything he needed to see, and there was no part of what we were doing that could be mistaken for anything else. He didn't shout. He didn't lunge. He didn't demand an explanation. He just looked at Ethan with a stare so clean and sharp I almost stepped in between them out of reflex, and he said only 2 words, steady and low and impossible to argue with, "Get out." And Ethan stepped back slowly, his hands lifting, off me like smoke, his jaw tight but his voice calm as he muttered, "Don't worry, I'm done." Like this was just the end of a shift or the closing of a door that was never really locked. I didn't move. I couldn't. I sat there on the edge of the workbench with my chest heaving and my shirt on the floor and my fingers trembling against the metal like I was trying to grip something real. And by the time I got down and pulled the fabric back over my skin and followed the trail of quiet devastation through the house, the kitchen lights were on and Michael was standing at the counter with his back to me, shoulders set like stone. And when I stepped closer, he didn't turn, didn't flinch, didn't even breathe differently. He just reached into his pocket, pulled off his ring, and set it down on the table with a sound so final it echoed through the room. And without looking up, he said, "Was this your plan all along?" I opened my mouth, but nothing came out because there was no good answer, no explanation that didn't sound like betrayal trying to dress itself in sentiment. And I stood there with my mouth open and my hands at my sides while he picked up his keys and walked out the front door without slamming it, without yelling, without giving me anything to hold on to except the weight of my own silence pressing hard against my chest. After he left, the house felt too bright, even with all the lights, off, too loud even though there was no sound, and I stood in the kitchen for a long time staring at the ring he'd left behind like it was a severed limb, something that once belonged to both of us, but now sat there cold and separate and final, and I wanted to cry. I wanted to scream. I wanted to collapse onto the floor and beg time to run backward, but instead I just stood still, arms limp, throat dry, eyes locked on that thin band of gold like it held every moment I'd taken for granted, pressed into its smooth surface, and all I could think was how fast it had all fallen apart and how stupid I was to think I could control any of it. By the time the sun set, I hadn't moved more than a few steps in any direction, drifting from the sink to the fridge to the back door and back again like I was looking for something I'd lost but couldn't name. And when my phone buzzed on the counter, I jumped like I'd been caught again, my fingers fumbling with the screen. And it was Emily, our daughter, the one who used to come downstairs in the middle of the night just to ask for a hug, the one who once told her friends I was her best friend. And the message was short, almost clinical, but it hit harder than anything Michael could have said. "Dad's staying at my place." He looked crushed. "What's going on?" And I stared at the words until they blurred, until the shame behind them twisted into something so thick I thought I'd be sick right there in the kitchen. I didn't reply. I couldn't, because anything I typed would have come out wrong, would have looked like an excuse or a lie or something worse, and I knew if I told her the truth I'd lose her too, so I just turned the phone face down and stepped away like it might accuse me if I held it too long. And that's when the second message came, a different tone entirely, a notification from a number not saved in my phone but too familiar to ignore. And when I opened the video, it started playing immediately, grainy black and white footage from a side-angle camera, just enough to see the edge of our garage, just enough to show me standing there with Ethan pressed against me, his hand slipping around my back, my fingers in his hair, my mouth parted in a way that made denial laughable, and beneath it was a single line of text. "Nice moves, Mrs. Carter." I dropped the phone. Not on purpose, not dramatically, just because my hand stopped working and the muscles in my arm gave out under the weight of what that message meant. Not just exposure, not just humiliation, but the realization that even our neighbors, the ones who used to wave from across the street and ask about Emily's school, now knew exactly what kind of woman lived in this house. And I wondered how many people had seen that clip already. How many would watch it twice? How many would send it to others with the same sick glee people reserve for gossip that finally confirms their worst suspicions? I picked up the phone slowly. My reflection warped in the cracked corner of the screen and set it on the table next to the ring. Both items now part of the same story I couldn't rewrite, and I backed away from them like they were burning, like they might brand me if I got too close, and I turned off the lights even though it was only just past 7. Locking the doors like that could somehow keep the shame outside, and I sat down at the kitchen table in the dark, the house around me still and heavy, the windows shut tight, the air unmoving, and for the first time in what felt like years, I didn't feel like a person anymore, just a mistake walking around in skin. I stared out into the quiet, every creak of the walls making me flinch like it might be Michael returning, or Emily, or even Ethan. And I didn't know which possibility terrified me more, and I thought about speaking out loud just to hear my own voice, just to prove I still existed. But I didn't. I stayed quiet, still, small, and alone, and the silence didn't comfort me this time. It swallowed me. By Monday morning, I already knew the email would come, already knew the tone before I opened it, that careful, cold language companies use when they want to remove you, but still sound polite. And there it was in black and white, right at the top. Due to a breach of internal conduct and professional standards, your employment with Westbridge Financial is terminated effective immediately. And beneath it, one line that hit harder than all the rest. We wish you the best in your future endeavors. Which might have meant something if I hadn't already seen the way the office girls looked at me in the parking lot the day before, whispering, behind their cups. Or if I hadn't received a silent call from the company's HR desk at 9:07 p.m. the previous night that I didn't pick up because I was sitting in the dark, holding my breath like that might stop time from moving forward. Bye, I. Tuesday, the photo had circled the neighborhood. Not the full video, not yet, but one still image from the garage camera. Poorly lit and grainy, but clear enough to show my face and Ethan's hands and the unmistakable way my head was tilted back, and I could feel it wherever I went. That invisible hand pressing against my back in the grocery store. The change in tone when I walked past the deli counter. The awkward pause when I reached the register, and the girl behind it looked down at my basket and said nothing at all. And I tried to hold my head up, tried to pretend none of it touched me. But when I stepped outside and passed Mrs. Langley, the same woman who used to bring me zucchini bread every summer, and she walked by without even a glance, her eyes straight ahead like I wasn't even standing there, that hit harder than any headline or scandal. The worst part wasn't the silence, though. It was the noise that found its way in anyway, like the voice of my best friend's son, 12 years old and too young to understand the weight of what he was saying but old enough to parrot what he'd overheard. And as I passed him near the mailbox, he looked straight at me and said, "My dad said you're trash," and then ran off like it was a game. And I stood there clutching the bills I no longer had a job to pay with and told myself not to cry in public again, not where someone might film it. The divorce papers came by courier 2 days later, left on the front porch in a thick envelope with no return address, no note, no explanation, just clean legal wording and a blank signature line at the end, and I flipped through the pages sitting on the bottom step of the stairs in my hallway, reading each clause like I was studying for an exam I'd already failed, and the only contact from Michael was the name of his attorney printed in bold at the top of page 1. Nothing handwritten, nothing personal, just lines and boxes and the legal decoupling of a life I thought I'd still be living this time last month. I tried calling Ethan exactly once, not to beg, not to explain, not even to ask where he was, but just to hear if his voice still sounded like I remembered. And the line rang 4 times before a recorded message cut in and told me this number was no longer in service. And when I drove past the shop where he used to work and asked the man at the front desk if he was around, he shook his head without even asking my name and said, "We don't deal with personal calls," and turned away like I'd never existed. I messaged Emily twice. The first time I kept it short, just "call me when you can." And the second time, 4 days later, I wrote a longer message explaining how sorry I was and how none of it had anything to do with her. How she was still the one thing I was proud of, how she could hate me if she wanted, but please don't shut me out. And both messages remained unread, the little gray checkmark under each one frozen like a tombstone. And when I clicked on her profile a few days later and saw the words, "Not delivered under a new attempt," I understood what had happened without needing confirmation. And now all that's left is this house, this shell of a place I once thought of as sanctuary. And even that feels borrowed now, because the HOA has already sent a formal letter urging me to consider relocation due to neighborhood concern, which is a polite way of saying the people who used to smile at me in the morning now wish I'd disappear quietly. And I sit on the porch and watch them walk their dogs on the opposite side of the street, their eyes fixed on nothing, their bodies angled like I radiate some kind of contagious shame they're afraid might reach their own front doors. I didn't answer the door when the next letter came, didn't open the blinds when the neighborhood board held their monthly meeting on the front lawn across the street, didn't respond when a former coworker sent a 3-word message that said simply, "They're still talking," because by then I'd learned that nothing spreads faster than scandal without context, and even less forgives slower than a neighborhood with manicured lawns and too much time to watch one house slowly rot from the inside out. And I told myself I'd stay quiet, keep to myself, wait for the noise to pass. But the noise wasn't outside anymore. It had moved in. I couldn't sleep through the night without pacing from room to room like I was searching for something I'd misplaced. Couldn't walk past the hallway mirror without glancing too long at the reflection that didn't look like me anymore. Couldn't cook without thinking of how often Michael used to sneak bites before dinner or how Emily would lean on the counter, scrolling her phone while I chopped vegetables. And now the silence was so loud I found myself turning on the faucet just to have something moving in the room. The last straw wasn't a letter or a neighbor or another ignored message. It was the way my own voice sounded out loud after not using it for so long, the way it cracked on the edges when I tried to say anything more than one sentence, like my throat had forgotten what language was supposed to sound like. And that morning I walked out to the car and sat in the driver's seat without starting, the engine just staring into the rearview mirror at a face I no longer recognized, my fingers gripping the steering wheel like I was trying to study something deep inside that wouldn't stop shaking. I sat there with the windows rolled up and the sun baking through the glass and the smell of dust and worn leather clinging to the seats like memory, and after a while I whispered, not to anyone in particular, not expecting an answer, not even really thinking about what I was saying. You saw what they saw. You just didn't stop. And the words didn't sting as much as I thought they would, because by then, the guilt had hollowed out so much space inside me that all that was left was truth. And truth doesn't hurt when you've already lost everything. I got out of the car and walked around to the back of the house, past the dying hedges and the rusted garden shears I hadn't touched in weeks, my feet moving without thought, following the same path they always did when I couldn't sleep, couldn't sit still, couldn't breathe through the noise inside my chest. And I reached the garage door and opened it slowly, almost tenderly, like it might groan in protest or slam shut on its own. But it didn't. It opened like it had been waiting for me. The air inside was cooler than I expected, still and stale, filled with the scent of old metal, faint oil, and something else that I couldn't name but had come to associate with endings. And I stepped in slowly, letting the door fall closed behind me, my eyes adjusting to the dim light as I crossed the floor to the center of the room where it had all begun, where everything I had unraveled in the space of one reckless heartbeat. And I stood there looking at the spot beneath the overhead light where I used to sit, where his gloves once lay, where I said yes without ever speaking it. The bulb above me flickered once, then died completely, leaving the room in shadow, and I reached up out of habit, as if to fix it, then let my hand fall when I realized there was nothing left to repair, nothing left to salvage, nothing left to pretend about, and in the darkness I looked toward the corner where the camera used to sit, the one that caught everything, that saw what I refused to acknowledge until it was already too late. And now it hung crooked, its lens cracked, the red recording light long gone. There was no note this time, no message under the hood, no sound of footsteps behind me or keys rattling at the door. Just the quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't offer peace but proves you've been left behind. And I sat down on the edge of the old wooden workbench, placed my hands in my lap, and listened to the stillness wrap itself around me like a sheet, pulled tight over something that was never coming back.